How do we fight misinformation in person and online? Find out how. Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. Welcome back to the podcast. On today, we have a recurring guest. You may remember him because he spoke to us about science communication when the COVID vaccine was about to come out. And I had the foresight to have guests on to teach us how to talk to our patients. We saw how well that went, talking to our patients about the vaccine. We need to improve how we're engaging with the community about science and science communication. So Dr. Matthew Facianni is back on the show. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Notre Dame in the computer science and engineering department. He previously worked at Vanderbilt University as a postdoctoral researcher and lecturer in the medicine, health, and society department. He received a BA in psychology from Westminster College, an MA and PhD in sociology from the University of South Carolina. All over the country he moves. And now he is just north of Milwaukee, so moving about the country again. His research interests include media literacy, identities, social networks, political polarization, and misinformation. His forthcoming book, Misguided, Where Misinformation Starts, How It Spreads, and What to Do About It, will be published shortly with Columbia University Press. So, Dr. Facianni, thank you so much for being back on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back.
Let's talk about one of the things that we really need to talk more about in healthcare, and that's misinformation, because a lot of our conversations are really an uphill battle against the misinformation that's out there. But misinformation, falling for misinformation is something that happens to other people, right? Like, not me. I'm a doctor. I'm smart. Like, I pick up on this stuff. I know information from misinformation, right?
I mean, you are smart, you are a doctor, but everyone is susceptible to misinformation. So that's something that I look at in my book and in my research, is looking at all these social and psychological factors that contribute to believing things that are untrue, and just how we believe things more broadly, how we process information. There's all these broader factors that impact how we process the world around us. And one of the main ways that I look at it is through the lens of identities. When we have these identities, they motivate us to process the world in a certain way. So, for example, a lot of times these identities can be really helpful in giving us meaning and navigating our social environments. So if we're a doctor or a scientist or a parent, we might have roles that we fulfill that are aligned with these different identities that we have. And it can make us feel really good when we act in ways that are aligned with those identities. Like we take care of our kids or we do a good job at work. These are, benefits of identities, this motivation to maintain consistency between the identities that we have and the roles that we have associated with them.
But then when you act or talk or speak in ways that conflict with your identity, that's what cognitive dissonance, right? That is like psychic pain that you cause yourself when you do something that conflicts with that identity.
Yeah, it can be really unpleasant. And that's one of the factors that can influence how we process information, is when we have that crossroads of, okay, this is conflicting with one identity that I have, or maybe we're motivated to protect that identity. So then it's not even cognitive dissonance, that we're pulled towards processing information in a way that supports that important identity that we have. And it's actually not cognitive dissonance in that part, because we're feeling good as we support that identity. And the easy example of that is a political identity. So political identities are so well studied in social science because they're so important for how we navigate society, but also because they're so huge, especially in the United States. They influence our behavior, our attitudes in so many different ways. So sometimes we might be really motivated to protect that political identity, and that can bias how we process information.
So if we're trying to limit our biases, we want to be able to accept new information as it comes in without that influence, right? We want to be as objective. We're supposed to be scientists, at least in some regard, right? We're supposed to be objective about how we take in and process information. So in order to do that, we need to limit how much like those identities are actually influencing how we process new information. So how do we do that?
That's a really good point. So identities are really helpful and help us navigate and connect with other people So there's a lot of good to identities. The issue is when we become too reliant on any one single identity. And really, the simple answer is have our identities be more balanced and more spread out. So we're not deriving so much self esteem and meaning from a narrow lens of identities. So again, like the easy example is let's just pretend all of our self esteem and how we see the world is through this one political perspective. And that like all of our friends think the same way. That's all of our hobbies, all of our entire worldview is like this one type of identity. Then we're super motivated to protect that. So that's one extreme example, but you can see how that can influence us more broadly, that if we have a rigid adherence to one particular identity because it's so important to us, that's going to create the bias. So basically the goal is to be more balanced and more spread out and not be so restrained in how we derive this self-meaning and self-esteem. So we don't feel like we really have to defend that identity all the time. And maybe there's some weaknesses that to that identity and the worldviews associated with it that we can admit because it's not so threatening to acknowledge that.
So, in order to be able to process new information and minimize my bias, I need to have friends and hobbies from a bunch of different groups.
Yeah. Okay.
That sounds like a lot of work for somewhat limited benefit.
Yeah. I mean, that's the issue, right? So it's like when we think about the amount of work and difficulty, just individually, but also just how our society is structured. I mean, there's all this research on like the growing loneliness epidemic in the United States and just this lack of what's called a third space, that we have our work and our home, but there's not a lot of like social communal areas where people can meet and grow their identity maps. You can like spatially think of your identity on like a map where there's all these identities that are spread out. And ideally we want lots of identities all over the place on this map where there's some are overlapping, but some are really distinct. But again, when the vulnerability to misinformation and biased information happens is when this map of our identities is really narrow and we're deriving all of this self-esteem from a narrow lens. So yeah, it's tricky because again, like our society isn't really structured where it's super easy to go out and meet lots of different people all the time.
But see, I was thinking it more of the lens of I just want to do what I want to do and hang out with who I want to hang out with. And here you're telling me in order to be more open minded to new ideas, I should be getting outside my comfort zone, which that being said, there are a lot of arguments for. And even, the more we're learning about this, the more we're finding that the strength of our social connections, right, are the greatest predictors of longevity and happiness. Putting yourself in the third spacing that you're talking about. In medicine, third spacing is something else. That's where fluids shift from your blood vessels to like the extravascular space. So we're talking about a different third spacing here for the physicians, right? If I'm even remembering that from like my general surgery rotation. But what you're talking about is just be more social. Like that's what you're saying is like get out between your work and your home, find other places to be because it's going to help you process new information in different ways. It's also good for your health and longevity.
Right.
But I was just pushing back against, well, it sounds like I'm going to have to do stuff I don't want to do. But I mean, really what you're saying is, well, just get out and do stuff. And inevitably you're going to meet other people and different people. Like just because I think of people that like, well, I'm going to be on the carnivore diet and I'm going to do CrossFit and there's going to be the same people here and there, but like, that's not necessarily the case, right? Like you will be meeting other people in different communities.
Yeah, ideally. So again, you could just keep meeting the same people and that's not really going to protect you. In fact, if you're only talking to the same people that think very similar than you, there's some evidence that could even increase your susceptibility to misinformation.
Oh yeah. Yeah. You want to stay part of your tribe. If they all believe one thing and you don't, then you might get excommunicated from the tribe, which is ingrained in us because 10,000 years ago, that could have been a threat to life and limb, right? Excommunicated from the tribe, you're all alone, you're dead. So yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. Let's take it from the other perspective, right? So that's how we protect ourselves from misinformation or falling for misinformation. We'll see people in a clinical setting or maybe even a social setting who are believing what we believe to be misinformation. We might be the purveyors of the misinformation, but we think that we have the right information. So how do we have productive conversations between two people that seem to have just different realities?
Yeah, it can be really challenging. So I do you have some suggestions on how to increase at least our likelihood of being heard? So I don't even try to think about like how do you change someone's mind? Like I don't even think that far ahead. I'm just like, how do we even get to a point where someone can hear our perspective and actually process it? And there's a few different techniques. I mean, the baseline is that you need mutual respect, right? So like that's just like you can't even start anything if both people are not having respect for each other.
Well, presumably the patient came to see us because they had some modicum of respect for us. It's in that direction I think we can check that box. So I think we need to check ourselves and make sure that we are treating the patient with respect. Not the
Mhm.
information that they have, but the person themselves.
Yeah. And yeah, that can be really hard. Like physicians, so many patients, and you're so overworked, and that it can be difficult to always have that extra empathy and patience whenever, especially if someone's, maybe pushing back a little bit. I imagine that could be challenging. So I'm kind of curious now that we bring up, like, how do you deal with that? Like, given all of the other challenges of your profession?
My approach has evolved because when it came to, when it was COVID, right? I was really would spend a lot of time trying to give people information, trying to leverage the fact that I had more information than they did and they trusted me. And so I would just give them information rather than trying to disprove their information. I've over time I've actually put less effort into that because I feel like it takes away from the visit itself. It makes the visits run longer. And then I have patients who are waiting in my waiting room while I'm trying to untangle someone's information. So I might like, drop a little something here and there, but I find it, you don't want to push back against their misinformation. You really just want to build, as you said, build trust. So
Right.
you just talk to them about some things. You might float something in there. You might drop some little bit of information or try and put it in a way that aligns with their health goals. So you're
Yep.
not contradicting their misinformation, but you're just giving them what you believe to be the correct information in such a way that is consistent with what they would want to they want to accomplish, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh, you don't want to give COVID to your grandma, and so in order to decrease your risk of doing that, you might want to get vaccinated. It's not perfect, but it's going to decrease your risk of that happening. Like just little bits of information. That's how I've approached it, just in a less time intensive way. Because oh my gosh, it can make the visits last forever.
Yeah. I mean, not only the time component, but I think just realistically, it could be really overwhelming to try to bombard someone with a whole bunch of new information. And ideally, you would want to build up that social connection and that trust before they even really fully listen to what you're saying. And then we can get into the nuances of how we frame our position so they're more receptive to listening to it. I think that's a good technique. And, what are their concerns? What do they care about? And then frame it in a way that I think that's a good approach.
Wait, so you're saying there's more to it? There are better ways for us to frame it.
Yeah.
You've
So
got something.
there's some research looking at this that I do talk about in my book that goes into these different, basically try to leverage the identity forces that I talked about earlier. If you can connect with someone with a shared identity, they're more likely to be receptive to what you're saying. So if you can, again, you think about like building trust, but if you can just relate to a shared identity that you have, that's the kind of a way to use those identity forces to improve the quality of the conversation. So relating to a shared identity, really good.
I'm part of your tribe, and we all have
Mhm.
many tribes, right?
Right.
And so
Right.
this is a tribe that I share with you.
Mhm.
And it could be something like we're both Buffalo Bills fans, right?
Right.
It could be
Exactly.
something simple. So finding ways to connect to them and show some common ground. That's great. Any other little, because what we really need are just like little nudges, little, things that don't take much time for us to be able to do.
Yeah. So relating to shared identity, shared tribe, shared interest, that's an easy and effective way to improve dialogue. If you are engaging with like questions and trying to, if you have time to push back, the how you ask the questions is really important. So if you are asking questions about why someone believes something, you actually don't want to say, why do you believe this?
Okay.
Instead, it's more productive to say, how did you come to that conclusion? And focus on that word how, and really dive into that mechanism of what's the step-by-step process, why you don't think vaccines are safe and effective, for example, instead of just like, why do you believe this? And it's really easy to just get on a whole different conversation. So how, I think, is a good word to remember.
Yeah. They might end up answering it with why, because they
Mhm,
might hear why
mhm,
instead of hearing how. But I think you can then be like, no, 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 I totally get it. I get the why.
mhm.
But could you walk me through the how?
Right.
Be like, no, 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 I believe you. I believe you. But so I think that also the way that you word that really demonstrates the mutual respect.
Mhm.
The why demonstrates a lack of respect or could be a
Yeah.
lack of respect. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then one other thing that you kind of mentioned too is really trying to embrace uncertainty. That's a good way to build trust in general for scientists and
Got a
physicians.
lot of that in medicine.
Yeah. So I mean, that was an issue with the pandemic, unfortunately, with a lot of the messaging from health officials. We saw these really strong, confident recommendations that you should do this, don't wear masks at the beginning, right? And definitely wear masks. And that's really confusing. And it makes people feel like, oh, these guys don't know what they're talking about, as opposed to being like, oh, well, this is an evolving thing and we're learning more. And right now the evidence suggests this, or we're trying our best to figure it out. And trying to be transparent about that process as how you come to those conclusions is helpful too.
But I think part of the problem is that a lot of the misinformation online is said with such confidence.
Right.
And yet we don't, because we don't claim to know. We claim to believe, right? Like, or
Mhm.
at least this is what I think right now with the information I have. Like, if patients ask me, is this surgery going to work? How I answer it. We wouldn't be doing it if I didn't think it would work, but there's always the chance that it won't. Whereas if you see someone online who's a purveyor of misinformation, they're like, oh no, this works every time. All of my clients get better. They all get giant abs, right? So how come it works for them, but yet we're leveraging uncertainty?
That's an interesting question. So I think that there's a couple reasons. One, I think depending on who is spreading that misinformation, if they already have a trusted relationship with their audience, then they want to see that confidence. Like they're going there because this person's telling them stuff that makes them feel good. So they
Yeah.
like that they're doing it. But instead, if you're like, here's this evidence based thing that's really complicated, it's always tougher to tell the truth than to lie, right? There's more nuance and complexity in reality a lot of the time. And on the other side, it's kind of an unfair fight. Like you can just lie and make stuff up with really strong confidence. And if people, the key is, it's really easy for people to believe those lies if they want to believe them. Like if that fits within their identity maps or
Yeah.
how they view the world, then that confidence is used in a way that increases belief. But if it's something that's more neutral or even somewhat adversarial, then that's where you want to try to embrace the uncertainty more.
In your book, you talk about pre-bunking, and that this sounds like a good also way for us to communicate with someone who may be believing misinformation or to maybe prevent the spread of it.
Yeah. So basically, pre-bunking comes from the word, it's kind of a play on words from debunking. So
Yeah.
debunking is just whenever you come in after the fact and you correct the misinformation after it's already been encountered. But the idea with pre-bunking is it exposes people to techniques or types of misinformation they might see and teaches them to be aware of them and how to process them before they encounter it. So it's this proactive measure of teaching people how to recognize different types of false information or manipulation techniques they might encounter in their environments. So that's the idea generally of pre-bunking.
So one of my podcast business manager, basically my head of operations, my everything for this podcast, who does everything aside from the interview. She's like, you really should be getting on or having guests on who have like these big shows. So I went through like the top podcasts in medicine. And the problem is a lot of them are like bro science, misinformation, like pseudoscience. It's like that's what sells. So it's just they're pushing ice cream and we're pushing broccoli here.
Yeah.
So it makes me tempted to like engage with maybe not their posts because I'm going to just get drowned out but whenever I do see posts online with misinformation from other physicians, I'm tempted rather to engage. Is there any point in doing that? Is there an effective way to engage with other physicians? So they're an MD, so they're like trusted because they've got well, I've got that too. So is there any way for me to like leverage the title and the education to combat their misinformation?
It's really tough because if you're talking about people with MDs that are purposely spreading misinformation for economic benefits.
I don't think they, I
Or
really don't
maybe,
think that they
maybe,
purposely do
or
it.
maybe they
I
just
think,
believe it because,
I think their identities evolved
yeah,
over time. Like they kept
yeah,
on turning towards the thing that got the best response.
right.
And then they just became like basically radicalized.
hmm So either way, it's going to be really tough. So even if it's you're, calculating this is, getting lots of clicks and that's why I'm going to keep saying it, then they have the economic incentive. Or if they're just identities evolve over time, or it's like I say something kind of controversial, I see lots of people like it, I start being friends with those people. Now I'm starting to, my identity map's starting to bubble up with this more contrarian truth teller that, or free thinker, or whoever they describe themselves in a way that resonates with their audience. Because again, like we were talking about, like they do use a lot of confidence in their language, but they're speaking to an audience who wants to hear what they're saying. The audience is already distrustful of mainstream science or evidence-based medicine. So they like hearing what this person is saying. So the short answer is it's really hard because there's a big barrier in the way of productive dialogue. Like you can try these different techniques, but first online, it's super duper hard to change someone's mind or have them listen to you. So ideally, if you want to engage with someone with another MD, you would definitely have better odds offline, in person, on the phone, over Zoom, like maybe before they get to that point where they're really big and getting a lot of influence for their views
So
and
pre-bunk them.
pre-bunk them. Yeah. Like, and it's tricky because I think about this a lot, like the asymmetry in information and how it's shared online. Like it's really easy to say a lie that people want to hear and tailor towards that audience. So ideally, you'd want to reach them before they get to that point and just, try to think like, what's their motivation? Why are they seeking out this much fame or influence? I mean, that's a whole other kind of broader question that
Yeah.
I think
I mean,
about.
because then the TV stations show up and the big
Mhm.
checks show up and, that's positive reinforcement. People respond to positive reinforcement.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So I guess we've got
It's
to
tough.
catch them as their star is rising and then
Yeah.
extinguish it.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. Yeah.
Okay. So part of the problem is, you know, is people like that, when they put their message out there, they'll often say things like, "This is what mainstream medicine doesn't want you to know, but
Mhm.
I know something that they don't know. They're keeping it from you, but I'm going to tell you. Buy my supplement." Right? So
Right.
this is what we're fighting against, and that was all over the place with COVID, which has eroded trust in healthcare. On top of
Mhm.
the reasons that you said, that there wasn't great messaging around uncertainty, so it was a
Right.
bit of the House of Medicine's fault. It was a bit of the misinformation spreading online. So we were totally unprepared for the next pandemic, which could be around the corner in like a mink farm,
Mhm.
right? How do we rebuild that trust?
Great question. It's really complicated. And I think there are a few ways though. So one is the messaging. That's a simple one that we can actually hopefully learn from. Like that's something pretty concrete that we can fix in the future is improving messaging by these spokespeople or officials to not be so overly confident at the beginning and then, completely change directions. That's hopefully we don't do that again because that was really bad. Other ways to do that before we get to the pandemic, that's, inevitable, right? There's always, like you said, it's just, there's so many possibilities of where that could come from that it seems like it's probably going to be another pandemic in our lifetimes.
Yeah,
What
bird
I
flu, monkeypox.
Yeah, we're
I
already
mean, it's
seeing types of them, right? It's just
yeah,
unfortunate part of our planet that we have those kinds of things.
yeah. I'm not sure which order it's going to come in, but we had an episode on bird flu, and basically it comes back to like the industrialization of livestock and cattle, that how we're treating animals and packing them all, and then they spread diseases among each other. And if they didn't
Wow.
live in such close quarters, then they wouldn't spread diseases like that. Just in the same way that if humans didn't live in such close quarters, we wouldn't spread diseases like that. So they're packed together,
Mm.
we're packed together, and it's not going to end well.
Yeah. So I guess in addition to messaging, we could also think about, building trust in our local networks. So if more scientists and physicians are talking to people they know and just building trust and sharing their expertise, even if it's their personal Facebook page, just kind of sharing the stuff they're working on, that's one way where if we have a lot of these local networks where people are finding these trusted messengers that they know. That way they're not relying on the CDC or some foreign theming agency that's telling them what to do. It's like, no, my friend Johnny who's on Facebook said, that before the pandemic even happened, they were talking about the viruses and what to do about. That's a way to kind of pre-bunk it. You're being proactive by building these social connections on social media is a really easy way to do. But just in general, like science communication, I'm always a big advocate of that and trying to have scientists engage with people, like really increasing the people element as much as we can. That's one way. I also think I would really like to see more agencies, institutions engage with their local communities too, and have this like dialogue where, for example, during the COVID pandemic, one way that different health agencies could build trust and communicate their messages was by establishing these relationships with local leaders like churches or barbershops or local sports teams. So instead of trying to do that, like as the pandemic was happening, it was really tough. But if you could actually engage with people ahead of time and actually build meaningful relationships at the community level, not the micro level, but actually like listen to what are the concerns of the community. We're going to invite these local leaders to our local health organization events and actually give them a spot at the table. Again, there's a lot of factors on actually making that happen. But ideally, in an ideal world, we would have a lot of these partnerships at the community level. And then when the pandemic happens, you already have that trusted messenger built in your network, and then they can go to their network. So that's something I would like to see more outreach in that way too.
That's interesting because I think that also gets back to identity.
Mm-hmm.
Like if
Right.
you have these relationships, you are already part of the same tribe.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of this being this is a new tribe that you're interacting with, this is someone who is now part of your tribe because you have an established relationship. And so there's trust. And then you've got that commonality. Amazing. Okay. So when is the book coming out?
I hope by the end of this calendar year. So before 2024 is over, I will have a pre-order link available and I'm going to spam it everywhere as soon as I know. But yeah, it's coming.
And if people want to find you online, I know you've been posting a lot lately on Threads. So thankfully that's coming around so we can leave X behind.
Hopefully,
And,
yes.
give our attention to Mark Zuckerberg, our new digital overlord. So people can find you on Threads. Where else can they find you online?
Yes. So I'm most active on Threads, but I do have accounts on Blue Sky, Facebook, LinkedIn. I mean, I post a lot of my research and papers on everywhere, Mastodon, but I'm most active on Threads. And then if people just want to keep up with my work, they can follow my website. I have a newsletter on there that I really only post every twice a year. I'm hoping to do it more. But if you follow my newsletter on my website, MatthewFacianni.com, I'm going to be posting when the book is officially available and sharing also all the research I've been doing. I've published a few different papers. So I'm going to be summarizing the results of those papers in that newsletter as well. So yeah, if you find me online, I'll definitely be talking about my work and my book when it's out.
And once again, that book, Misguided, where
Misguided.
misinformation starts, how it spreads, and what to do about it. So Dr. Matthew Facianni, thank you so much for coming on the show again.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. So please share it or like it or comment on a social media post or write us a 5-star review. Thank us again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.